the Banana King, was once described as one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet, and the stories about him sound almost exaggerated until you see the pattern. When a foreign government refused to give him the terms he wanted, he did not simply complain or accept defeat, because he helped remove that government. When competitors tried to take his market, he treated business like warfare and openly tried to crush them, and somehow, this same man built a giant empire from nothing, starting as a teenage immigrant with no money, no network, and no obvious path upward. Before history labeled him a king, he was just Sam, trying to survive, trying to learn, and trying to find a product he could sell. If you're into money and investing, subscribe and support this video with a like. Now, let's continue. Sam's journey is one of those underdog stories that begins in desperation and ends in scandal, power, and international consequences. Along the way, he crossed paths with famous figures in American business and politics, from presidents to financiers, whose names still dominate history books. The strangest part is that the entire chain reaction begins with something ordinary and perishable: ripe bananas that other traders considered almost worthless. Sam Zemurray's rise cannot be separated from the controversial empire of United Fruit, a company so dominant and so feared that it earned the nickname the Octopus, because it seemed to wrap tentacles around everyone it touched. If you think you have heard every wild corporate story already, this one has a way of surprising people, because it combines hustle, logistics, corruption, and geopolitics into one uninterrupted climb. Sam Zemurray was born in 1877 and grew up on a wheat farm in western Russia, in a life shaped by scarcity rather than opportunity. His father died while he was still young, and that loss pushed the family into a deeper financial struggle, leaving Sam with few options and fewer comforts. He wanted more from life than the farm could offer, and he knew that one of his uncles had already made it to America, running a modest grocery store there. At 14 years old, Sam made a decision that would have terrified most children, because he gathered every last penny he could and set out on a one-way trip to the United States. He arrived with virtually nothing, but he carried a simple plan that would define his early years: start at the bottom and climb by working harder and thinking faster than everyone around him. At first, that meant doing the most basic jobs in his uncle's store, stacking shelves and taking on whatever tasks kept the business moving. Even then, Sam was not satisfied with simply earning a wage, because he treated every day as a lesson in how money actually flowed. He watched what customers chose and what they ignored, and he listened carefully when suppliers talked about pricing, demand, and delivery. When he found extra work, he took it. Not because it was glamorous, but because every small paycheck brought him closer to independence. He worked as a tin merchant, a house cleaner, and a delivery boy, saving obsessively and spending as little as possible, because he believed that the person with cash in hand could act when an opportunity appeared. That opportunity arrived in 1893, in a moment that sounds almost ridiculous in hindsight, because it began with Sam seeing his first banana. In the late 19th century, the banana trade in America was still developing, and many Americans had never even seen the fruit, let alone eaten it regularly. Bananas were exotic and unfamiliar, closer to a novelty than a staple, and the supply chain was difficult because the fruit bruised easily and ripened quickly. Sam saw that banana and became fascinated, not because it was glamorous, but because he sensed that something new, misunderstood, and growing could become profitable. By that point, he had already realized that working for other people would never make him rich, and he wanted a product he could buy and sell on his own terms. After seeing that first banana, Sam formed a plan that was simple in concept and risky in practice. He would go to a nearby port city called Mobile in Alabama, where fruit boats arrived from Central America and the Caribbean, and he would try to buy bananas directly from the flow of imports. Then he would sell them in nearby towns quickly, pocketing the difference between what he paid and what local merchants would offer. Nobody could have predicted what that small decision would eventually turn into, because at that stage Sam was just one poor teenager chasing a tiny slice of trade. Mobile was a busy, chaotic port where ships delivered goods from across the world, and the docks functioned like a daily marketplace where deals were struck on the spot. Sam arrived intending to watch first and learn the rhythm, because he understood that ignorance was expensive and mistakes would destroy him. On his first day, he watched a fruit boat operated by United Fruit come into the harbor, and he immediately understood he was looking at the dominant force in the banana business. United Fruit imported enormous quantities of bananas, often from Jamaica and other producing regions, and their scale allowed them to set terms that smaller traders could not match. Sam stood there watching how the operation worked, taking in every detail as if he were studying an enemy. The unloading process was brutal because there was no modern mechanical equipment doing the work. Men rushed onto the ship and carried banana bunches by hand in the heat, moving thousands upon thousands of heavy loads as quickly as possible because the fruit did not wait. The labor was made worse by the hazards hidden in the plants. Because scorpions could nest among the leaves and sometimes sting workers without warning, Sam watched this back-breaking routine and noticed something that most people ignored because it looked like waste. Once the bananas were unloaded, company agents sorted them into 3 piles, each one representing a different level of value. The first pile held the green bananas in perfect condition, the fruit that would last the longest and could be shipped farthest without spoiling. Those bananas were loaded onto trains and sent around the country, where they could be sold at the best price. The second pile contained bananas that were turning yellow, meaning they were closer to ripening and could not survive as long in transit. Those were sold locally at a discount to store owners and peddlers who could move them quickly. The third pile was the one that caught Sam's attention because it was made of ripes, bananas with black freckles that were still edible but dangerously close to spoiling. To United Fruit, those ripe bananas were practically worthless because without dependable refrigeration and tight scheduling, they often could not reach a paying market before turning soft and foul-smelling. In that era, as much as 15% of a shipment could end up too ripe, partly because bananas release gases as they ripen and can cause nearby fruit to ripen faster. That meant one bad cluster could trigger a chain reaction. And for large importers, the ripes were a constant enemy. Most traders stayed away because the window was brutal, with only 3 to 5 days to sell everything before it became unsellable sludge. If your transport delayed or your customers hesitated, your inventory turned into garbage. Where others saw risk and hassle, Sam saw an opening that fit his situation perfectly. He did not have the money to compete for the best green bananas, and he could not outbid established buyers who already controlled prime supply, but he could buy what nobody wanted, then win by moving faster than everyone else. His childhood on a farm where food mattered may have sharpened his instincts because he could not accept the idea that edible fruit should be treated like trash. The real barrier was not quality, but time, and Sam was willing to gamble on speed, hustle, and creativity. At that moment, Sam had about $150 to his name, representing years of saving from every odd job he could get. He walked down to the pier to negotiate, and the scene must have looked strange to the company agent. A teenager with a thick Russian accent was asking to buy thousands of leftover ripe bananas at a steep discount, betting everything on a product that most people did not even understand yet. Because United Fruit often struggled to sell those ripes, the agent was happy to accept Sam's offer, and the deal was made quickly. Sam did not spend all $150 on the bananas because he kept enough to pay for a railroad boxcar on the Illinois Central Railroad, giving him a place to store the fruit and sell directly as the train moved town to town. In theory, the plan made perfect sense. If Sam could sell the bananas before they spoiled, he would make a profit because he bought them cheaply. In reality, he was stepping into a race against time with his life savings on the line, and he was about to learn why other traders avoided ripes. The train left the next morning, and Sam had almost no margin for error. Because he had spent nearly all his money, he could not afford a proper bed like other passengers, so he slept in the boxcar among his bananas. It was uncomfortable and undignified, but he barely cared because he was focused on the calculations and confident he could beat the clock. That confidence began to crack when he discovered how slowly the train actually moved. Trains stopped for hours for crew changes, scheduling conflicts, or additional cargo, and those delays were lethal to a business built on fragile fruit. A trip that should have taken 3 days could stretch into 5, and Sam could literally watch his inventory changing color and smell as time slipped away. The freckles spread, the scent thickened, and the fear became physical because he built his entire plan on the assumption that the transport system would behave. In that moment, he understood why most traders refused to risk their money on ripes, because you could do everything right and still lose everything to a delay you could not control. When the train stopped again for another long wait, Sam made the kind of decision that reveals the core of his personality. He ran to a nearby Western Union office and spoke to the telegraph operator, explaining that a train loaded with cheap bananas would soon pass through several towns ahead. He asked the operator to contact other operators along the route and spread the word to local merchants, grocery owners, and peddlers, so they would be waiting at the stations ready to buy quickly. Sam promised the operator a cut of the sales if he helped, turning the telegraph network into an early form of rapid marketing and demand creation. The idea was blunt but clever. If the customers were waiting on the platform, he could sell in minutes instead of hunting for buyers in each town. The tactic worked. When the train arrived at the next stations, people were already gathered to meet him, and the bananas moved quickly while the train was stopped. Because Sam bought at a discount, he could sell cheaply and still make money, and the low prices made the decision easy for buyers. By the time the train reached its final destination, he had sold the entire load. When the week ended, Sam had 190, meaning he made $40 profit. And in the 1890s, that amount represented serious money for someone who had started with nothing. He was thrilled, not only because he had more cash than he had ever held, but because he had proven a method that exploited a neglected corner of the market. Sam also recognized something crucial about his position. He could never win if he tried to buy the same green bananas the big companies bought, because their scale gave them superior pricing and access. But by focusing on ripes that others dismissed, he found a niche where speed and hustle mattered more than capital. The margins were smaller, and the stress was constant, which is exactly why the major players did not bother. But for Sam, the niche was a doorway. Within weeks, he returned to Mobile, bought more ripe bananas, rented another boxcar, and repeated the process. Then he did it again and again, until his life became an exhausting blur of trains, platforms, negotiations, and frantic sales. Every trip was a gamble, and Sam's success depended on managing ripeness, like an engineer manages deadlines. Over time, he refined his system, learning to sort ripes by how far along they were, because a banana with only a few freckles could last 5 or 6 days, while an overripe bunch needed to be sold immediately in the nearest towns. He moved closer to the docks so he could be there at dawn when ships arrived, and he tried to buy every ripe banana he could get his hands on. The import companies were happy to see him because he was one of the few people who actually wanted their ripes, turning their waste into cash. Around the docks, he became known simply as Sam, the Banana Man, a young peddler whose hustle drew respect, but rarely serious fear. The numbers began to climb quickly, and the pace of his growth surprised even people who watched him every day. In 1899, he sold around 20,000 bananas, and by 1903, he was selling well over 500,000 per year, proving that his small niche was larger than it seemed. In that same year, something unusual happened that signaled he was no longer invisible. The president of United Fruit, the largest player in the banana business, asked to meet him. During the meeting, the president told Sam he admired his willingness to take risks, and the two men negotiated a contract that would transform Sam's position. The agreement stated that all the bananas United Fruit imported that were already ripe or turning ripe would be sold exclusively to Sam Zemurray. For United Fruit, the deal created a guaranteed buyer for the part of the shipment that caused headaches and losses. For Sam, it meant a stable supply without constant dockside negotiation and uncertainty, which allowed him to plan and expand with less friction. What once looked like a strange obsession with risky fruit now looked like a disciplined strategy that solved a real problem. By the age of 21, Sam had reportedly saved more than $100,000, and when adjusted for modern value, that would represent a fortune for someone so young. If the story ended there, it would be a clean underdog success, a clever immigrant finding a niche and climbing into comfort. But Sam was not built to stop at comfort, because once he tasted success, he wanted the kind that changes your relationship to everyone around you. After years of selling ripes, he felt he had reached the ceiling of that model because he was still operating at the end of the chain. He was buying fruit that someone else had imported, using someone else's ships and supply decisions, and he knew the most lucrative power sat earlier in the process. If he could import bananas himself, he could capture larger margins and move from peddler to producer. But that step required an entirely different level of capital and capability. He would need deals with farmers overseas, infrastructure to move fruit from plantations to ports, and a fleet of ships to carry bananas to the United States before they spoiled. To make that leap, Sam needed partners and investment. He formed a partnership with a man named Ashbel Hubbard, and together they invested in steamships, building the transport backbone necessary for a serious import business. They also acquired the Cuyamel Fruit Company, which owned roughly 100 acres in Honduras, a climate well suited to banana cultivation. The plan was to work with growers, expand cultivation, and ship bananas directly from Honduras to American markets. The move was bold because it pulled Sam out of the safe zone, where he only risked a boxcar load, and it pushed him into the messy reality of Central American land, labor, politics, and disease-prone crops. It is in this phase that United Fruit's influence becomes impossible to ignore. United Fruit agreed to invest a small amount for a minority stake in Sam's new venture, becoming a silent partner, even though the new company could one day compete with them. At first glance, that seems strange, but it fit United Fruit's broader strategy because the company was famous for wrapping its influence around every player in the industry. The nickname El Pulpo, meaning the octopus, came from the sense that if you were in bananas, United Fruit either owned part of you, controlled your supply chain, or was actively trying to destroy you. They built dominance by making countless deals with independent farmers and smaller importers, then absorbing them into their growing conglomerate. United Fruit was also strategic about appearances, because a fully visible monopoly could attract legal trouble. In an era shaped by the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was designed to break up monopolies, it helped to have smaller competitors in the market as proof that competition existed. So United Fruit tolerated certain rivals, including companies like Sam's, because their existence could be shown to regulators as evidence that no monopoly was present. The reality, however, was that United Fruit dominated bananas through capital, land, logistics, and political relationships, and they controlled enough of the supply and distribution network to influence prices and availability. They even operated one of the largest private fleets in the world, a collection of 115 ships known as the Great White Fleet, which allowed them to move fruit at scale and maintain control over shipping schedules and routes. Compared to that machine, Sam was still small, even if his income had grown into the hundreds of thousands per year. Importing bananas made him richer, but it also revealed how much of his revenue vanished into payments to farmers, sailors, local officials, and intermediaries who could delay or disrupt shipments. He began to see that United Fruit's real strength was not simply owning ships, but controlling the entire supply chain from cultivation to export to distribution. If Sam wanted to become more than a tolerated competitor, he needed deeper control because without his own production, he would always be squeezed by those who owned the land and the political leverage. The conclusion became obvious to him. To compete seriously, he needed to grow bananas himself. That realization pushed Sam toward a decision that many American businessmen of his era would never make. He chose to leave the relative comfort of America and head into the Central American jungle, where bananas were grown and where the real battles of the industry took place. When he arrived in Honduras, he reportedly traveled widely, sometimes by mule, because he wanted to understand the country's geography, politics, and opportunities with his own eyes. He met with Honduran officials and sought special deals that would lower his costs, reduce or eliminate taxes, and grant him favorable treatment in import and export duties. In plain terms, he bribed officials, though the system often dressed such arrangements in polite language by calling them concessions. In the banana business, which ran on thin margins and fragile fruit, those concessions could mean the difference between profit and failure, and many officials were willing to cooperate for a kickback. With those deals in place, Sam bought large amounts of land for extremely cheap prices, because locals often considered it worthless swamp or overgrown wilderness. Sam's farm background gave him a different perspective, because he understood soil and climate and could see that beneath weeds and waterlogged brush, there was valuable growing potential. He hired as many workers as he could and began the brutal process of turning wilderness into banana farms. The work was physically punishing and dangerous, made worse by snakes, scorpions, and clouds of mosquitoes in the humid heat. Sam often worked alongside the laborers, sweating and swinging a machete, helping clear brush, lay track, and plant the crop, which was unusual for an owner in that industry. He also developed contempt for competitors who managed their banana empires from distant boardrooms in the United States, detached from the land and the people who produce the fruit. Sam embraced the Honduran environment more directly, socializing with locals, drinking with them, and making a real effort to learn Spanish so he could negotiate and connect without constant translation. He promised jobs, and, to his credit within the industry's harsh context, he paid more than many other employers in the area, even if the wages were still low by any modern standard. As the operation grew, housing was built for workers, forming a small town in the wilderness, and Sam spent much of his time there rather than retreating to an American office. Those years gave him a knowledge of the banana business that most executives never had, because he experienced every step from clearing land to planting to harvesting to shipping. Sam later argued that understanding every role in the supply chain was his real competitive secret, because it made him better at solving bottlenecks and controlling costs. At the time, however, many rivals simply thought he was reckless and eccentric because he lived in the jungle and behaved in ways that sounded strange. Stories spread that he ran odd personal experiments, sometimes eating only bananas, then eating everything except bananas, and even standing on his head after meals because he heard it improved digestion. These details made him seem unpredictable, but they also reflected an intensity that never turned off, even in his private habits. Meanwhile, the business itself was improving because with concessions, cheap land, and hard-earned operational knowledge, Sam could export bananas at costs comparable to the industry leader. Predictably, he wanted more. He began searching for additional land and planning further expansion, knowing that scaling meant hiring more workers and building infrastructure, such as roads and rail lines, so bananas could move quickly from farms to docks. Those projects required large injections of capital, and this is where the banana industry's risks became unavoidable. Bananas were vulnerable to heat and cold, drought and flood, storms and disease, and a single shock could wipe out a season's profits and leave debts unpaid. By this stage, Sam had already taken out substantial loans, and banks became reluctant to extend more credit because the industry's volatility made lenders nervous. Sam saw the moment as a rare opening and argued that they needed to buy land quickly before others did, going all in while prices were still low. His partner, Ashbel Hubbard, did not share that appetite for risk. Hubbard favored caution, suggesting they stabilize operations, pay down existing loans, and expand gradually through reinvestment rather than gambling on massive debt. The disagreement revealed a deeper conflict in temperament because Sam treated hesitation as weakness, while Hubbard treated patience as survival. Rather than compromise, Sam offered to buy out Hubbard's share, and the irony is that he financed the buyout by taking on even more debt. Since he was already stretched with traditional banks, he borrowed from more dangerous sources, including loan sharks and criminal-connected lenders who charge extreme interest, sometimes approaching 50%. It was a desperate, aggressive move, and it shows how willing he was to risk collapse for the chance at dominance. After the buyout, Sam owned about 90% of the company, while United Fruit held the remaining 10%, leaving Sam with full operational control and responsibility. The structure meant he could move fast without arguing with a cautious partner, but it also meant he carried nearly all the risk if anything went wrong. At this point, the story shifts from a clever hustle into something darker and larger, because Sam was no longer just a banana trader with a boxcar. He had plantations, ships, political concessions, ruthless debt, and a powerful silent partner watching closely from the shadows. And from here, Sam's path becomes a true all-or-nothing bet, because he was building the kind of empire that does not forgive mistakes.